Hello, thank you so much for joining me today. I want to talk to you today, as always, about Chinese medicine, but specifically about the concept from Chinese medicine of the blood. Now, this is a little bit different than the blood that you may know to be flowing through your veins in your arteries. It has an energetic component to it, and you might be wondering if you heard your acupuncturist or your herbalist mention something about blood stasis, or blood deficiency or heat in your blood. And it might sound a little strange when you hear them say this. Or they might say, well, you have a certain other type of deficiency. And when you ask what that is and they say that's part of your blood, it may initially make no sense. So really quickly, what I want to do is just talk about the different components of the blood, a little bit of interesting history, and that's it for today. So without further ado, when we talk about the blood, just like when we talk about different organ systems in your body, we actually capitalize the word, or the letter B rather, and we capitalize the word as a way to be clear that we're referencing the Chinese concept of blood. Now, that doesn't mean we need to be dismissive of this concept or dismissive of the even science of Chinese medicine, because as we look beneath the surface just a little bit, we'll start to realize that the Chinese were onto something thousands of years ago. The Huangdi Neijing, which is one of the older textbooks of Chinese medicine, actually speaks about the blood and these different concepts, and it dates back to 475 BC. Many scholars would argue, sometimes as recent as 200 BC. But either way, it's a very ancient text. It wasn't until the 1800s that the centrifuge, which is that device which can separate the different components of your blood, was actually first used. It wasn't until the 1930s, roughly, that actually became a popular tool that would be used on a more mass scale. Meanwhile, in the 1600s, usually people date it to around 1658-ish, there was a Dutch scientist who actually looked under a microscope and for the first time actually identified red blood cells. So what does this have to do with Chinese medicine? Well, we know if you put your blood in a centrifuge, you can separate white blood cells, you can separate red blood cells, you can separate plasma, that type of thing. That's when you end up seeing these tubes with these clear separation of the different aspects of your blood. The Chinese, meanwhile, as again, far back as 475 BC, we're already writing about some of these concepts, although they use some different terms. So the Chinese said the blood has two major components to it, a yin component and a yang component. That is a component which is darker in nature, a little bit slower, a little bit more restful, versus a yang component, which is lighter in nature, more active, busier. And they referred to that darker component as what they called your yin qi. That's Y-I-N-G-Q-I. Now, your yin qi is frequently translated in English nowadays as your nourishing qi or your nutritive qi that's found within the blood. This is the darker aspect of your blood, and it's said to actually bring different forms of nutrition, energetic as well as actual chemical nutrition, and moisture to the different organs and tissues within your body. Meanwhile, the other aspect, the yang aspect of your blood, was lighter in nature, brighter in nature, more active in nature, and that was said to be your wei qi or your defensive qi. The defensive qi is what actually would fight off external pernicious influences or things that we might nowadays call a virus or bacteria. They might have called that a form of evil qi once upon a time, but it's pretty clear that they're talking about these types of things, which we now would refer to as bacteria, as viruses, etc. And they would say that inside your blood, it had this component to it that was very good at finding, attacking, and getting rid of or eliminating these forms of negative energy that might otherwise invade your body and cause sickness or disharmony with your internal systems, causing you to have things like a common cold, what we now call the flu, malarial type conditions, all these different types of things. So again, that would be your lighter quality in your blood, your more active, your busier quality, and we call that your wei qi. That's spelled W-E-I-Q-I. So now we see a darker aspect to your blood that nourishes and brings nutrition to the cells and the organs, a lighter aspect to your blood that fights off pathogens and things that might make you sick. It sounds a lot like that Ying Qi is what that Dutch naturalist in the 1600s discovered as your red blood cells. And meanwhile, the Wei Qi sounds a lot like your white blood cells. And we all know nowadays that that's a huge component of your body's ability to keep you healthy and fight off viruses and bacteria and things like that. So they also said you have something called the clear and the turbid fluids inside of your blood. This is what we refer to as your Jing and your Ya, Jing and Ye. I'm probably not pronouncing it that well. Of course, I'm not a native Chinese speaker, so I apologize ahead of time for any time I slaughter tones or pronunciation. Either way, the Jing and the Ya were said to help lubricate the joints, provide the fluid and the substance and the moisture for the blood itself. It sounds a lot like the plasma or perhaps some of the synovial fluids, things like that. And again, these are fascinating things to think about, that 475 BC, they weren't only talking about it, they were already writing about this as a concept and conceptualizing this and starting to expound upon it and explain these concepts to other individuals. They did this without looking under a microscope and saying, there's the red blood cell. And they did this without putting your blood into a centrifuge. That wouldn't come for not only hundreds, but thousands of years later. And yet they had these concepts. And although we might not be used to the terminology, the Ying Qi, the Wei Qi, the Jing and the Ya, when we start to look at what they were talking about when they describe those terms, and we start to look at what we now know, it's pretty fascinating how accurate a picture they were actually able to depict and to explain all those thousands of years ago. So when you're told by your acupuncturist or your herbalist or your doctor of Chinese medicine, you have a blood deficiency, you can then maybe ask them and surprise them. Don't let them know you've seen this video and say, is it more of a Wei Qi deficiency or a Ying Qi deficiency? And you'll be in just enough knowledge to get yourself in a whole lot of trouble potentially. So this is of course not used for medical advice. This is just explaining terms that can sound a little bit foreign at first and make you a little more comfortable with some of the terminology. So feel free to like this video if you did. Feel free to give me a comment in the comments below if you're seeing this on YouTube. And always, as always, I'm loving the idea of sharing my knowledge and sharing just a little bit of whatever wisdom I have with other people. So feel free to ask me any questions you have. If there's a specific topic, please let me know and I'll do my best to address it if it's appropriate. I hope you're doing very well. Peace, and I will speak with you soon.